Hi and welcome to this week's Schneider Electric Renewable Roundup podcast. I'm Russell Redding, Head of Energy Markets here at Zygo, and this week I'm really pleased to be joined by Mark Chappell. Mark is our expert on European PPAs and has agreed to talk to me this week about Poland. I'm really excited to hear about what's going on in this emerging market, and if you are too, then click the link at the bottom, or you can reach out directly to Mark or check out the website at zygo.com. Right, now I've said all of that, I want to find out what Mark thinks is going on in Poland. Hi Mark, thanks for joining me this week. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Russell. Great to be here. Second time on the podcast, and just came back from a nice holiday, so I'm feeling refreshed.
I'm looking out the window here, Mark, and I have to say the sun is shining. So thanks for bringing that back, even though I know where you went and there was no sunshine.
Yeah, I'd say the opposite, more blizzards than anything, but no, good to be back in the sunny UK.
Yeah, excellent, cool. I wanted to talk to you this week about a market that I've been hearing quite a lot about. So I've been hearing and seeing that, you know, maybe 2025 showed a bit of a softening in the PPA market, a bit of a slowdown. But quite a few people are talking about sort of up and coming areas. And without teasing it any further, so you know, and because I know you're an expert on this area, I see how I'm dragging it out here. I'd like to ask you about Poland. So,
Okay.
for context, what do you think? Am I right? You know, did 2025 maybe slow a bit? And am I also right? You know, is Poland a bit more up and coming? What's going on there?
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say that 2025 was not a difficult year, but a challenging year. So I think you alluded to there. So the number of deal flows executed began to plateau, almost fall off a little bit, as you said. We see that quite clearly, and it's visible in our data, in our deal detective, and the PPAs that we see across Europe. And this is the case in many European countries, like particularly those that are, or those that were, for example, the early movers, the Spanish market, you know, German market, the UK, for example. But we are beginning to see some new emerging markets, as you say, towards the east of the continent. Poland is one of those, and Poland is one of those that's beginning to buck the trend as well. So 2025 was a record year in terms of megawatts of capacity signed under PPA in Poland. Um, it's for a long time, it's been a curious one, like high potential, but arguably hard execution. But the signs are, as you've mentioned there, this could be beginning to change, and the market is starting to mature as well. So yeah, really kind of curious to see how this plays out over 2026 and beyond.
That's really interesting, and it's really interesting, as you said, that the deal, the data from the deal detectives is showing that. Have you got a view on, should we say, what it is that's kind of being built? What kind of renewables? Is it any particular technology? Is it well balanced? Is there something particular that's causing that bucking the trend?
Yeah, so it's predominantly solar PV that where the growth has been exponential. So considerable build out, and with considerable solar growth, as we all know, comes with it some associated consequences and also trends. So with, you know, vast solar PV build out, there is a particularly strong production in the summer, for example. We've seen negative prices across Europe in various jurisdictions, and Poland is not separated from those impacts entirely. We see lower capture prices, so that's kind of been fascinating on the solar side of things. Onshore wind, to be frank, is scarce. It's hard to find. So this is primarily because of political intervention, I would say as well. So there is a minimum distance required of 700 meters under local planning mechanisms. So for that reason, it can be quite difficult to obtain, the permitting, the grid connections, etc., for these wind projects. So what has been, I guess, a heavily skewed towards coal historically, has recently seen an influx of solar with some wind, but it's definitely more towards the solar PV side. But I should mention as well, I mean, another interesting point is that there was an offshore wind auction in Poland this year that actually fared fairly well, which came as somewhat of a surprise, I think, given that, we've seen, Russ, like some of the auctions across Europe this year for offshore wind have really struggled, with cost pressures, inflation, withdrawals, no bids in countries like Germany or the Netherlands or France. So, given that this was like an inaugural round for Poland, and they aim to host further auctions, it was kind of surprising to see that almost the full 4 gigawatt cap was accepted as part of those auctions. So that's a positive, and also it's encouraging. Like I'm sure you'd have an opinion on this, but like just deeper renewable penetration in general is always a good sign, and can build confidence across the market, regardless of whether it's offshore wind, solar. It just kind of helps to meet some of those flexibility solution needs, and it's just a more visible long-term direction and power mix, that can build some certainty.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mark. I hadn't necessarily appreciated, the strong solar growth, but I think if planning's challenging for wind, onshore wind, then you can kind of see that, it, with a good, how do I put this, a good level of cost, as in for deployment and, maybe easier planning, that would push solar. A bit like you, I'm not sure what to think about offshore wind because you're right. There's been lots of places like Germany where it's just struggled to fly. CFD-AR7, that in the UK, that provided a good chunk of offshore wind again. But having said that, we seem to be, really committed to that, which I get. Yeah. So in some ways, it's sort of like surprising that it was, what, nearly 3.5 gigawatts of capacity was awarded, but in then some ways not. So I'm not sure what to make of it.
Mhm.
But as you said, good news, because they're dropping these, they're increasing and they're scaling rapidly. One thing you did say in that, and I wondered if this was something that might influence like the corporate side of that PPA equation. You said that there's quite a lot of coal-fired generation in
Mhm.
Poland. Does that mean then that the grid's quite carbon heavy, and does that mean you've got a good story then if you're a corporate buyer, because you're saying my, I don't know, 100 megawatts in Poland is
Yeah.
shifting more carbon than my 100 megawatts somewhere else in the EU.
Yeah, exactly. No, I couldn't agree more. I think we are getting closer to 2030. And I know a lot of corporate buyers out there had 2030 down as a particular milestone for sustainability commitments, that they need to adhere by. The time is arguably running out a little bit. I know we're kind of only just over halfway through the decade, but it takes a long time to, as well as I do, like close some of these PPA transactions. Sorry. So yeah, it is important that the grid is heavily coal dependent, because I guess under the right commercial conditions, buyers can now, I guess the phrase is, move the needle a little bit faster on emissions, faster in Poland than in some of its neighboring countries in Europe, for example. Especially Western European grids where there's been significant deployment of renewable energy systems. So each megawatt hour of renewable procurement in Poland can deliver a comparatively large scope to an impact, arguably, and reputational benefit versus some markets that may already be, let's say, more green, if that makes sense. Do you agree? Do you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's a bit of a shame the way we sort of almost do it. You know, we look at it and say, yeah, we've delivered, I don't know, 100 gigawatt hours of renewable generation, let's say in Spain. Okay, fine, it's great, and that goes in a corporate, it's decarbonisation, it's great. But I do think sometimes maybe it would be encouraging to give those corporates more recognition, because for the 100 gigawatt hours in Poland, which is significantly higher and decarbonizes that, because that, as you say, moves the needle more. Now, I think maybe that's what some of the GHG stuff will work through into, with its
Yeah,
locality and its matching. And we won't go into that state, because otherwise we'll
we'll be
spend
here
another
for an
10.
hour.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, another 10 minutes just to think about that before we even start. But I think that's fair. I think, yeah, there's demand growth in Poland, and I think it's great to see that the renewable growth is coming to support that, and support the grids. Um, I also get, so I think there's two things to talk about then. That I get the impression again, from the data I've seen, that actually some of the projects in Poland, in terms of their kind of, the way you might assess their value, actually look quite attractive,
Mhm.
at the moment. And because, I think that's hopefully fair comment. And of course, then I can't really do anything without saying, what about BESS? Is that also a factor, do you think, in Poland?
Yes, absolutely. I think almost like in a nutshell, so the story is becoming more compelling. So we've talked about the phase out of coal, we've talked about expanding renewables. You've mentioned rising demand and the types of profile of corporates within the region, looking at these types of agreements as well. And we've again mentioned earlier, that deal flow is up compared to other neighboring countries, but the the kind of different part of the equation is that growth is now expected in a new environment with more sophisticated technologies, as you mentioned, like BESS, new
Hmm.
contract structures. We're seeing a huge diverse array of the types of BESS offers coming in now, which has grown considerably since, the beginning of 2025. So it arguably makes the cycle different. And it will kind of change the growth of corporate PPAs in Poland compared to some of the earlier markets, the earlier movers. Especially as we mentioned, some of the trouble with uh, solar cannibalization, negative pricing, capture rates, all of this is in some degree risk alleviated by the BESS. And this is kind of going to be a really kind of important factor to watch in Poland, but not just Poland. I guess, other countries within the region, that there is a lot of, particularly in Southern Europe, solar dominated renewable systems as well.
Yeah. I love what you've done there. Once again, as always, Mark, you take my random and disparate thoughts and weave it into a story. So thanks for that.
No worries.
So you did touch on, you did obviously touching on BESS.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that maybe comes out of that a little bit is that, potentially there could be constraints in the grid within Poland.
Hmm.
um and they are, I know they're working on things, they're working on the queue and how they work that.
Yeah.
They're working on the process transparency, and on obviously grid investment. But I'm guessing, obviously, again, just like lots of other places in Europe, maybe the kind of Polish energy system is learning, and BES helps potentially with the grid bottlenecks.
Yeah, I somewhat agree. I think in some countries the queue seems to be worse than others, but Poland is not without its difficulties as well. It seems to be a European-wide issue. A lot of governments, um, authorities are trying to address the situation, but it's challenging, it's difficult. Like a number of measures have been implemented nationally, internationally, and it's still seen as kind of a critical challenge across Europe for the further expansion of renewables, especially with, this influx of potential demand from data centers and AI across various countries and some of the forecasts for the total demand, over the next 10, 15 years are absolutely crazy and wild.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
We're
they,
seeing
they
that.
do need to address this problem. But yeah, I think Poland, another kind of challenge that Poland is facing as well is this, it's been going on for years, is this lingering uncertainty around AIB membership as well. Um, Whether, the GOs will eventually be under the EECS system, whether they're, cross-border. What will happen to geo demand if Poland is to join AIB? It could potentially become a net exporter of certificates. And we've been seeing it for such a long time, like talk about Poland joining AIB. I think it was only recently in Resource Poland where they mentioned that those discussions are ongoing, but without like clear timelines, that's always a problem, and it can cause some hesitancy on the corporate buyer side to perhaps pursue PPAs in countries where those certificates aren't cross-transferable.
Okay, interesting. I was going to ask you that, and you beat me to
Yeah.
that because I was wondering whether, um, I suppose it's a complex web, isn't it? If you are, shall we say, working on locality and matching, maybe you're thinking that's what the GHG is going to do, and you've got load in Poland, then it kind of doesn't matter if you like. I think so much that he's not in the AIB, but maybe if
Yeah.
you're a corporate and you're looking at it, strategically, and you're saying, oh well, there's a really interesting project in Poland. It could be a wind project in Poland, even, or something like that,
Hmm.
that really helps balance up your portfolio both geographically and with a profile and everything else. Then maybe that could be a barrier. That's quite an interesting one.
Hmm.
As always, Mark, I think we've got to time. That has been really interesting. I do appreciate it. I know you've been working on this a lot,
Yeah.
and you've been beavering on reports. If people want to know more, what can they do?
Um, yeah, no, good point, Russ, and always happy to be on the show as well. I'd say feel free to reach out to myself, or Russ or LinkedIn. Alternatively, we have just produced a report on this country, on this subject in more detail. So we will share the link and the details, I'm sure. Um, and I just kind of want to close out as well and say that the commercials, Russ, we didn't even mention that. But th those are starting to become far more interesting in Poland. Again, like one of the reasons for the encouraging deal flow. And like Russ says, like please just reach out and we'll have a conversation in more detail about this subject.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We've got a lot of data. Yeah, that you've done the report. That's great. And I think if I'm summarising to come back to why is Poland a hotspot? The the financials are looking good. There's good growth in projects. There's high carbon grid, and it's becoming a kind of a space where there's a lot more opportunity if if you can accept around the AIB membership and everything else, which is in a state of flux, like you say. It's been going on, and you could see it. You could see it happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super. Mark, thank you as always for joining me. It's been
No
really nice to
worries.
have you. Yeah, thanks, and I'm sure you'll be back again at some point. And have a lovely week.
And you too, Russ. Cheers. Thank you.